Welcome to Ruth.
Thank you very much. My name is Ruth DyckFehderau. I'm a writer. I also am an adjunct professor at the University of Alberta, and I teach in English literature and creative writing, although I haven't done that for a number of years. In my other job, I write I write nonfiction books for the James Bay Cree of Northern Quebec, and they own that material. So these days, I'm working on a series of their residential school survivor stories. We launched one book in 2023, and there are 3 more books for forthcoming, and so those are very intense stories. Yes. Big thank you to Valerie for this lovely opportunity, and to Tuseme Books for supporting marginalized writers, generally speaking. After I met Valerie in, I think it was a Writers Guild of Alberta event, and right after that, I went online and started digging into Tuseme Books, and I've never seen anything quite like it, because it's cherry picking and showcasing some really wonderful literature. And those of us who are marginalized writers, we appreciate it. So I want to talk a little bit about dismantling stereotypes in prose, like fiction and nonfiction, in stories, generally speaking. And then I'll do a short reading. And if you have questions at the end, just, wave your hands or scream at me or something like that. It's a small group, so we don't have to wait to the end for questions, just interrupt. So to start, I want to put on my professor hat for a couple of minutes. When I teach writing, when I teach creative writing, a few key principles always come up. And one of them is that trope or stereotype is actually just careless writing, period. Sometimes it's from a lack of effort. Somebody doesn't want to do the work. And sometimes it's from a failure of the imagination. Because even in genre, like in a mystery or romance, you still can't use stereotypes. Characters need complexity. So Stephen King writes genre. His genre is horror. And he says that writing is refined thinking. So for me then, good fiction and nonfiction prose writing involves 3 things. First of all, the skill of observing detail and interpreting it. Not interpreting, just observing it, like being able to look at something that happens, observing it, and not trying to put a meaning into it. Chuck Palahniuk, who wrote Fight Club, he said that your job as a writer is to pay way more attention to the world than others do. And then the second key thing is the skill of articulating that detail. So these two, observation and articulation, if you can manage both of those, they're both actually really difficult, but if you can manage both of them, your stereotypes are gone. Because ordinary people do not respond to ordinary events in cliched ways. And Margaret is a therapist. I'm sure she's up against that all the time. People's responses are human. They're not cliches. Then the third thing is similar. It's a willingness to say what you really see, but without telling people what to think, because preaching is just unsufferable. Nobody's going to want to read that. People are messy. Stephen King says that bad writing arises from the stubborn refusal to tell stories about what people actually do, to face the fact that serial killers help old ladies cross the street. So the one that I think about all the time is Roy Cohn. He was an American politician who made McCarthyism happen. He was a horrible bully. And he was also an oppressed gay man who died of AIDS. He was both of these things. So when you're writing, then if you have some kind of a tension or a conflict, it's important that people on both sides of that conflict are credible, and that they are just going about their normal business, whatever normal to them. They're neither villain nor victim. They're just doing their thing. And if you're trying to impose motives on them that aren't there, you're going to run up against all kinds of problems. And then after that, it just comes down to the work, to doing the labor of developing characters, of writing in the details about the people that you observe. So George Saunders gives this example. You can say, on the one hand, that Bob is an asshole. Or you can say that Bob snapped impatiently at the young barista who reminded him of his dead wife, whom he missed so much, and especially now at Christmas. So a couple of phrases, and the stereotype is gone. And you also have something way more interesting. You have something that feels like a person. Yeah, for me, that is that feeling that a character could be moving around in my world. That this is not a character that's confined to a book. This character could be moving around in my world and is credible. For me, that's what's going to drive a story. So for this novel, the first thing I want to say is that it's fiction, even though it's historical fiction, and I researched really hard for a very long time. I don't draw on any one story. I draw on many, many stories. So for this story, I worked in the field of people with developmental disabilities and head injuries for many years. So at institutions, in group homes, in day programs. I started when I was a teenager. And like just doing that for summer jobs, and I kept at it, and eventually it's what paid for grad school. In those years, and in many of these situations, I met a surprising number of people who had been misdiagnosed and institutionalized. And that's what happens to the protagonist of this novel. She is misdiagnosed and she's institutionalized. And this especially happened in the 50s and 60s, when the eugenics from World War II was still in the air a little bit. So often what would happen is that a kid would have a high fever, and in those days we didn't have vaccines, or at least not as many of them. So they might have a high fever or an injury. It could be something even like polio, and it would result in deafness or blindness, or polio, like a withered leg, sometimes epilepsy or cerebral palsy. There would be some kind of physical change in the body, and clinicians would just assume that there was an intellectual disability as well. And so this is how there just got to be so many people in the institutions and group homes and day programs that were not intellectually disabled, but they were physically disabled, but they were kind of held in this place. So when I started talking about that, about, you wouldn't believe what I'm finding out as I talk to people, or, blah, blah, blah. I would always get one of two responses. And the first one would be abject horror. People would be more horrified by not having their intellectual ability recognized than by someone being wrongly imprisoned, like somebody being charged with a crime they didn't do. So they found that more horrifying. So then that sent me down a rabbit hole about, why do we have such places if they actually horrify us? And then the other very common response was, oh yeah, that happened to my aunt or grandmother or neighbor or great aunt or whatever. So gradually I realized this is actually a pretty significant part of Canadian history. But the thing that I find really interesting is that all of the stories were about women. And almost every time it was left to this woman who is in this horrible situation to figure out a way out of there, to figure out a way to communicate to the people who are looking after her that she didn't belong there. And, you know, that never happened. Like there was always such resistance. That of course led to more reading and more research. So that's just a bit of background to this particular story. When it came then to doing the writing, I needed to be really careful about not using stereotypes or tropes. So one of the ways that I did that is obviously just familiarity with the material, a lot of research, understanding how these systems work so that you can catch yourself before you actually just write something that doesn't fit in that situation. So any person, even somebody who is vegetative, is more complex than a cliche. And if you're going to be able to get past that stereotyped representation, you're going to have to become familiar with material. So for further accuracy then, there are lots of parts in the novel that were not my specialty. There are not things that I'd spent time learning other than, you know, very briefly. So I sent excerpts to 2 different psychologists. One to talk about the sessions between the protagonist and her therapist, and another to tell me how she thought people would respond to these pressures. So those are 2 separate conversations. I sent excerpts to a geologist, other excerpts to a pharmacologist. I spoke for quite some time with a woman who was a psych nurse in the 60s and 70s. By the time the 80s came around, I was working in the institutions myself, so I could draw on my own experiences, but I needed somebody else to talk about the decades before that. Okay, so then the next thing I did to try to avoid stereotypes was to consciously look at my representations and make sure that I wasn't doing anything that was depressing or exploitative or boring. People who are queer and people who have disabilities, they especially have to deal with the ways in which in stories they are used as a prop in somebody else's story. So you have the fabulous queer person who is used as a prop to show that the straight white boy is cool. Or you have a person with disability who's used as a prop to show that this protagonist is compassionate or something like that. Then another sort of wave through the entire manuscript, I tried to keep track of anybody who would be called a patient at any point, which was the word that they used in the 60s and 70s. And whatever their condition was, I included a character who had the same condition, but was not a patient, because I was trying to show that but this is also socially constructed. How we understand disability is not an innate thing. It's something that, it's a lens that we put on to look at the world. So anyone in the novel who was a patient, there would be somebody who was not a patient who had the same condition. So the head psych nurse in an institution and a young institutionalized boy both have severe agoraphobia. A patient and a psychometrist both have pica, so that sort of thing. I was aiming to show just the randomness that comes with these labels. And then finally, if there was somebody who I thought had a quality that someone might find surprising, I tried to make sure there was a credible reason for why a character might be a particular way. So we have a quarry worker who loves geology. He wants to go to grad school to study it, but financially he's not able to swing it. So he does start doing his own research, but we have a geologist who doesn't like getting his hands dirty. And that's actually one of the reasons, one of his motivating reasons for going the research route. We have a porn star owner. So I tried to think about what would make a porn store owner rich. And essentially, he is not aroused by the porn. He is not aroused, and he is not distracted by it at all. And so he can make very dispassionate business decisions about his porn store. We have a doctor who over-medicates severely because he wants to keep people safe. And we have another doctor who misdiagnoses because of exhaustion. These are, I thought, very human reasons. But that I set out to avoid stereotypes doesn't mean that other people don't read them in, or maybe just I wasn't effective enough, because once we got into book production, and once the book got out there, a lot of the responses I have had have been actually about trying to understand why a particular stereotype isn't there. So in my experience from years of doing activism, in any kind of writing for change, you are always dealing with what people believe is an ideal victim or an ideal villain, but mostly an ideal victim. So they won't be compassionate towards a person if they think there's a quality in there that makes her a less ideal victim. So one example would be, you have a girl who's been raped, and the first question is, what was she wearing? If she was wearing something that they thought was too revealing, then, well, actually it's her fault. That would be an idea of what does an ideal victim look like. So that got forced onto the book quite often. Some of the examples that I encountered, this protagonist is, she is deaf. As a child, she had a high fever. It left her deaf. She was misdiagnosed and put into an institution. But she is on a trajectory of independence. As a child, once she was 4, she was put into an institution. She's in an institution for many years, and then a group home, and then she's living in assisted living, and finally she's independent. So my agent at the time, she said to me, this protagonist absolutely cannot be independent. You can either marry her off, or you can have her move in with family, but she is deaf. She is disabled. She must be taken care of. And I was like, I'm mostly deaf. So then, I mean, for this kind of a situation, I'm wearing fancy doodads. So it was revealing that someone would think that of me. To be clear, an agent's job is to make it saleable. So this was a question, this was less a reflection of who she was, but more of a reflection of how she thought a book might make money. She was also deeply uncomfortable with the talk of adult diapers. But if you are working with people with disabilities, adult diapers are a fact of life, in the same way that diapers are a fact of life for children like Mia. But the agent was extremely uncomfortable with that. Similarly, she was extremely uncomfortable with the idea that adults who are living in an institution would be sexually active. So that was that's something I still want to apply pressure to. There is this idea that if somebody is disabled, they have to be asexual or something. It's a really interesting thing we've done to ourselves, thing we have imposed upon our society. Eventually, I parted ways with that agent, but her ideas were not uncommon. She was just trying to, make a good sale, but I still run into those ideas. The book production team, once we got into that, in our first meeting around the book cover, one person came with the idea. He just came in and he said, okay, so your protagonist is deaf, and that means that she wants to hear, so I think that the cover should be a sound wave. And I was just like, why do you think she wants to hear? Sorry, I'm just not getting this. And as we started unpacking that conversation, it was clear that he believed that anybody who was not like him would want to be like him. It was a very interesting situation. Deafness in the novel is in fact not a problem at all. She doesn't want to hear. It's a fact. She is deaf. She has been deaf for most of her life. But in deaf communities, people talk about deaf gain. They believe that their community has aspects that a hearing community can't have. And so, there's no self-pity there. Another person at the table thought that the cover should be cold and clinical, sterile. And she had read the book twice at that point. And so I asked her, I said, what scenes make you think this book is cold and clinical or sterile? And she said, well, there's a clinic and an institution. And I had just come from the conversation with the agent who didn't want adult diapers. And so, because she thought it should be more sterile. So it's just, the same conversation from another side. One person in production wanted me to remove all scenes and words that showed discrimination. And she said that by writing those scenes, I, as a writer, was being cruel to living people with disabilities. So then I realized that, and this is right after COVID, and I think that's part of it. It just made me realize that there's all kinds of conversations we're not having. We're finding ways to step around them. But if a young woman in this field actually believes that what we have to do is take any conflict out of a story, then there are conversations that need to happen. In Ontario Book Club, they thought that the novel had too many gay relationships. So that one kind of stopped me in my tracks. There are 2 gay relationships. This takes place, the novel starts in a small town, and there is an older gay man in one generation, and then there is a young boy who is also gay and who's just coming out to himself. So there are in fact 2 gay characters, and eventually they both have partners. But the book club just thought that that was unbelievable, that a small town would have 2 queers in it. And so once I started asking a few more questions, then I found out that they were confusing. There's also a pedophilic relationship in there. And an older man is exploiting a young boy. And they thought that was the same thing. So again, I was sort of back to this place where I thought, okay, we're not having certain conversations. So I'm not quite sure what to do about that. That kind of gets my activist side going, and it also gets my writing side going. But I've certainly learned a lot about what kinds of conversations we are not having. And that is how it works. I mean, generally, if we don't think about it, we see complexity in our own communities, but in another community, we'll just lump everybody together and assume that they're the same. And that's where we get the cliches. I actually caught myself at one point. One of the most loathed literary tropes in the queer community is the kill your queers trope. The idea that you got to find a way to get rid of your queer characters once you're done with using them as a prop. And in an early draft, there was a car accident and a gay man died in it. And I realized as I was giving a presentation to the Federation of BC Writers that I had that trope, that I just hadn't caught that. So it was an early draft, and I was able to go back and revise it. There's still a car accident, but the gay man lives and he goes on to have a good life. The one that most surprised me was that I ran into a lot of misogyny and ageism, and that it's still kind of, you know, I've been a feminist for so many decades, and I was just taken aback at how rampant it still was. So one reader said to me, "Your ending is wrong. Your protagonist chooses independence over romance, and no woman would do that." So, you know, I know this guy. We both know many women who have done exactly that, but he couldn't do that. He couldn't do that. He had compartmentalized it in some way, and we've never been able to really. I've asked a few times to get back to that conversation, and he can't do it. In an early book design, the designer had brought the text with flowers and curlicues everywhere. So when I started saying, "So what's behind this? Why are you writing flowers and curly? Like, why are you putting this in?" And the response was just, "Well, middle-aged women like flowers." So I said, "This protagonist is a biker chick, and her day, like, she spends her days repairing engines. Flowers are mentioned nowhere." And the response is, "Yeah, but she's middle-aged." So I guess at some point I should be I should be expecting a newfound love of flowers. The book cover that we ended up with is beautiful. It's also a little bit random. There is one character who has a project about an apocryphal woman character, and the cover is a classical painting of a different apocryphal character. So when I just asked, "So this is beautiful. Where did this image come from? And how does that connect with the book?" And they just said, "Oh, it's a strong woman." So then I thought, okay, so Margaret Thatcher, Simone Biles, and Indira Gandhi, all strong women, they must be identical. So just a word, writers almost never have say in the cover. So I knew to let that go, and I was really happy that the cover was actually beautiful and eye-catching. So it's not a complaint about the cover itself. It's just something that kept on surprising me was the ways in which people were seeing me. It even crept into the marketing. The poster for the first book event that we had, it had a picture of me off to one side and the book off to another side. And in the center, bright, lit up, framed, was a picture of a young white man. It was extremely perplexing, with no name, no recognition of who this person was. Who it was the guy who opened for me. He read a few poems before I started reading, and he's a lovely man. This had nothing to do with him. But this poster went out with, it was, you know, it had my name and book launch and all that kind of stuff. And the center image was this white man. And I realized that, again, in conversations later, that the production team had believed they were helping me. because it was post-COVID and they just didn't think anybody would want to read a book that was written by a middle-aged woman. And so by simply inserting this image, that it, that would somehow help. We had a really great turnout. About 70 people crammed into this little bookstore, and I knew absolutely every single person in that room, but they believed later that it was still the picture of the young white man on the poster that did it. So all this to say, I might be trying to write complex characters, but that doesn't mean that that's what people see. The wonderful thing about it is that all of these moments, deeply frustrating as they were, they did end up being conversations, conversations about stereotypes and how do we talk about that. And that's the only way we're ever going to get through this, that and having bookstores like this one that helps us to do it. Okay, I'm going to do a short reading. Do you guys have any questions before I read a couple paragraphs? Sorry, a couple pages.
I have one, and maybe it's not a big question, but maybe the rest I'll say for later. But now I'm just wondering about the title. This is Athena, right?
Yes.
Yeah, curious about that.
So the protagonist, she is given one name when she's a child. Her parents name her Verity Blessure. So Verity means truth, and Blessure is French for wound. So her name together means truth wound. And then when she starts to take control of her own life, she changes her name, and she chooses the name Athena. So as you're reading through the book, the Athena, it always comes up like that. I, Athena, blah, 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 blah. And as she's journaling her own story in Athena's journal, she talks about herself. She says, I, and then she puts her name in brackets, Athena. And then as she gradually as she gradually comes to terms with who she is, the brackets get lost, and then it's I, comma, Athena, and it's just a clarification at that point. But yes, I did take that from Greek classical writing. So Athena in the classics is born from the forehead of her father. And in this case, her father is the one who believes that she is not just deaf, but disabled, and he takes her to an institution without her mother's knowledge. So her whole life ends up being this idea that comes from the forehead of her dad. So I don't know if that, yeah.
That's beautiful. I've actually, coincidentally, I've been listening to a podcast full of Greek tales.
Yeah.
So yes, I'm like, wow, this is like a really strong woman. And what you just said right now, that her father was like, you're negative about her because of her condition. Like Zeus was trying to make sure that Athena was not born. So there's a lot of parallels there. It's beautiful. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Moni, did you put up your hand?
Yes. So I was going to ask, so being born from the forehead, is it a metaphor for an idea? Like, basically, her dad essentially had an idea about who she is, but did not actually know.
Well, it's Greek myth. It was written a long, long, long time ago. So it's been interpreted as that, certainly, many, many different ways. And then in other myths make it very physical, like very, it's a story, and it's an old story. And certainly it's been interpreted that way many times. But all kinds of magical things happen in the Greek myths, so or in any cultural myth, really. There's often presence of magic.
Mhm.
Mhm. All right, you guys okay if I read a few pages? I timed this, it comes in at about 8 minutes, 7 or 8 minutes. Okay, so the protagonist is Athena. As a young girl, she got a high fever in a scarlet fever epidemic, and she ended up being deaf. She was then misdiagnosed by an exhausted physician as profoundly retarded. And then she was institutionalized for 30 years. Now she's out of the institution and she's living on her own, and she's trying to write her own story. But she has major memory gaps, mostly from the medication she had in the institution. Mr. Sarsgaard is her next door neighbor, and he owns a porn store, and he is also, in many ways, her most relied upon friend. Imran is her assisted living support worker. He visits twice a week. And Arvo is her companion in the institution. Arvo is nonverbal, and he's agoraphobic. After the institution, he moves into a group home, and Athena is only in the group home for a very short time, but he stays in a group home for quite some time. We don't really know very much about his intellectual ability or disability. We just know that he's nonverbal and agoraphobic, and he and Athena have their own language. And this was something that I found when I was working in group homes and institutions, that the people that I was working with, they would often be able to communicate with each other in very sophisticated ways. And I would not necessarily be able to do that. It might be a sign language or some other kind of a language. And I would not cotton on to what they were talking about. In fact, there was one group home that I worked in, and it had 5 brothers who had the same condition. And they had a very sophisticated language. They would have dinner like anybody else would have dinner, and there's conversation going back and forth. And there was a 6th brother who also had the same condition, but he couldn't live with them because those 5 bullied him so badly. So that's another interesting thing to think about. All right. So this is Athena's journal. So in this section, she is, this is taking place in 2003. She's been out of the institution for over a decade already. Yeah, today's day, Athena's journal, October 22nd, 2003, Wednesday. Today's day is a visiting day. I wake to the sunlight just after 8 a.m. I make hot coffee, eat breakfast, and I think about how I will renovate the apartment if Arvo comes to live here. A light flashes high on my kitchen wall. I look down from my window, and my neighbor and friend, Mr. Sarsgaard, is standing on the floor, on the lawn, 1 floor down, with his mirror, signaling me. He waves that I should come down. I pick up a pen and a notepad and a jacket on my way down the stairs. Do you have a minute? He writes. I have a machine that I want you to see. Mr. Sarsgaard does not know sign. He is timid, he mumbles, and he does not look directly at me when he speaks. I cannot lip read him. We converse through notes. He loves machines as much as I do, but he does not understand them. He frequently buys new sound systems, cash registers, and televisions for his XXX stores, but he needs help installing them. And they often stop working because the connection comes loose or because he does not use them properly. He calls me then to repair them. I follow him to the back of his store now, expecting to find something to repair. There by the stucco wall sits a vintage black BMW R68 motorcycle. He has ordered a sidecar, he says, but it will not arrive for a month. It is ravishing. My mouth falls open. I drop the pen and paper and walk around the bike, stroking the elegant tank and the curve of the seat and the muffler and the pipes and the kickstand. Mr. Sarsgaard picks up what I dropped and smiles as he watches me smile. Would you like to go for a spin? He writes. Spin? Slang for ride. Would you like to go for a ride? I just smile. He hurries into his store and he brings out 2 helmets. It's a strange sensation to wedge my head into something so tight, but I do not mind. I zip my jacket and clamber on behind him, and we go for a spin around the neighborhood. He is not yet a good motorcycle driver, Mr. Sarsgaard. He must often compensate for oversteering, and my balance is less developed than most women my age. Sitting upright on that narrow seat is hard work, and sometimes we wobble. But I do not mind. The back of a speeding motorcycle, cold wind on my teeth, is a fine place to be. It is a sensation to file away and remember on sad days. And then it is 10 a.m. and Mr. Sarsgaard must open his store, and it is time for me to visit Arvo. I gather my things and walk to the bus stop. The first time I took a city bus, 10 years ago with a care worker, I was terrified. I could not maintain balance when the bus was in motion, not even while seated. 10 years ago, walking down a sidewalk seemed Herculean. Others lifted their feet. I shuffled and limped and fell. Often. Now I can walk and take the bus, no problem, as Imran says. I take the bus frequently. Sometimes I even jog to catch it. At the Greyhound terminal, I approach the wicket. Today my ticket purchase is uneventful. I write that I am deaf and I want to buy a ticket. The agent smiles and prints out the ticket, and I pay for it. I climb aboard the coach and settle into a seat near the front. I nap a little on the trip, and 2 hours later, we arrive. I walk to Arvo's group home. A pile of long fence posts sits on the front lawn. 5 are already planted, shielding the suburb from the great brick house. A corner of a handmade picket sign sticks out of the trash can by the door. I lift the lid. The sign reads, "No Nut House in Arlington." I push the doorbell. Arvo's group home key worker opens the door, and Arvo is already there. Twitchy, gangly, hair flattened by constant smoothing, generous ears poking out sideways, and as tall as the door itself. He pushes her aside, and then he is hugging me and crying a little and hugging me more. He is always happy to see me. He takes me by the hand and pulls me inside. I smile at the key worker on my way past. Her mouth stretches into a flat line across her face. He leads me first to his room. He tries to shut the door, but she follows us and prevents him from closing it. He goes to the closet then and shows me a new t-shirt with a gearwork print on the front, and a new pair of running shoes, and a pen from the Sunshine Mountain Ski Resort. A tiny chairlift with skiers slides up and down the mountain when you tilt the pen back and forth. He laughs some more and kisses my neck. He tries to push the worker out of the way, shut the door, and she braces against the door jamb and smiles, but she will not budge. I would like to take him for a walk, I sign. It is a beautiful day. Arvo is agoraphobic. I am the only person he willingly ventures outside with. I'm sorry, Athena, she signs. I wish I could say yes, but the neighborhood has restarted the anti-group home campaign. We're afraid they'll throw things at our clients. With this news, Arvo and I retreat to the living room. I do not like their living room. It has framed Bible sentences about purity and holiness on every wall. Religion is one of those things I do not yet understand. The repeated phrases and intentional construction of belief seem duplicitous to me, but it is the only place we can sit. Arvo cuddles into me, crying on my neck and then kissing the tears away. The worker goes into the kitchen and starts making dinner. Between moments of affection, we play pick-up sticks. Arvo has his own rules. I do not mind. And we sign in a language no one else understands. She keeps an eye on us over the bar. I am so tired of being watched and not seen. He eventually falls asleep on my shoulder, slouched down with both arms around me. And in the late afternoon, I stroke Arvo's face to waken him, and I say goodbye. He cries a good deal, and I leave to catch the bus. On the long ride home, I count light poles. 4,287. A distraction to bridle my tears. At home, I reheat some dal for supper. Imran joins me as he often does on visiting days. He knows I long for comfort after leaving Arvo. To the meal, he contributes fresh naan from the Indian grocer and his homemade mango pickle. After supper, we make chai. And I show Imran the painting, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, in a modern painter's book from the library. After Mr. Picasso completed this painting, the book says, it so shocked his friends that he hid it, this magnificent piece, for 10 years. To create something so inviting and then to lock it away, we think it must have been unbearable. And now it is time for bed. I plan to fall asleep thinking of the wind in my teeth on the motorbike this morning. Maybe one day I can drive the bike and Arvo can be my passenger. I'm still getting used to all these Google icons. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you, Valerie, for this opportunity. I really appreciate it.
That was such a lovely section that you chose to read. And also your reading is awesome. I want to just sit and listen to you read the whole book. So maybe we should make a date and, and have some chai so you can read to me.
Oh, I love reading. I love reading. And reading aloud is a big part of my writing process. My partner listens to everything I publish at least twice, minimum. It's a lot of love. Yeah. So, yeah.
It's pretty awesome. Maybe I can just ask you a question before you continue, right?
Mm-hmm. No, I'm done. That's all I have to say.
Oh yeah? Okay.
Yep.
So I guess I was thinking of so the way that you've written the story, Athena, is I guess in a way to confront stereotypes, or at least that's what we're talking about, how you can use fiction to confront or dismantle stereotypical thinking. Mm-hmm. And so I do wonder, or I'd like you to talk about how, while you're writing the book, what you use, or did you apply any, either sarcasm or like some subtle ways of calling out the, stereotypes. So like, have you, like just in your writing, was there irony or some tone thing or a structure that you use to kind of critique systemic biases without coming out right to say it?
Right. Okay. So the way I usually do that is is in the scenes themselves. What the characters have to fight with. So there's one point where the psychometrist says to Athena is always being tested and she's always being evaluated. And that grew from working in a particular group home, and there was a man with autism in the group home, and his father became very frustrated with the ways in which the staff were always trying to figure out a new way to communicate with this person. And at one point he said, why can't Mark, I mean, that wasn't his real name, but why can't Mark just be Mark? Why do you always have to be testing him? And at the time I was like, oh, yeah, like I just hadn't thought about that. So Athena at one point gets very frustrated and she starts researching all of the IQ tests that she's always being put through. She realizes that they're all pretty much bogus for one reason or another. And she tries to teach this to the psychometrist. And she says, I won't resist. I know that, you know, I have to go through this if I'm going to have a normal life, but so I'm not going to resist you, but you know, did you know this? And did you know this? And did you know this? And finally the psychometrist says, well, yeah, you know, I wrote a letter once about the sexism in the IQ test, that it's always all about white men. But I haven't really challenged it beyond that. But at the end of the day, we still have to do this test. So it was usually through something like that. I don't use a lot of sarcasm, no, because if I want my readers to be completely absorbed into a scene. And if a narrator is doing that kind of thing, it often pulls people out of the scene and brings on the analytic brain, and I want them to be experiencing it. So occasionally, a character might be sarcastic a little bit. But Athena herself, she's pretty straightforward. She's very awkward and bookish, and she knows that she doesn't really, you know, 10 years outside of the institution is not a lot of time for somebody to really, she is not socially adept, let's put it that way. And so so she runs into awkwardnesses because she is sometimes too direct. So she's not often ironic. There are sometimes little digs here and there, but it's not very often. So most of the time, if I was trying to dismantle it, it was through the scene itself, by trying to show what it feels like to be in that kind of a position all the time, and then also to show how ridiculous it is. Like, you know, we follow her through the institution, and it seems, I hope, pretty obvious to a reader that this is a bright kid. But the psych nurses, all of the workers, they don't see it. They just read the file, and then they impose that on what they're seeing. Yeah, there are. So yeah, I would say I didn't use a lot of irony in this one. In another book, I might, if I had a character who was ironic and sarcastic. There is a hearing near the end of the book where she's trying to gain custody of Arvo. And so there is a custody hearing. And in that hearing, there are 4 people who decide, and they disagree amongst themselves. And their disagreement is sometimes quite sarcastic. They're being very pointed. Yeah, but mostly I tried to create scenes that were a bit more direct, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Thanks. And maybe I'll just ask you one more question and then let other people ask if you guys have questions. But I was just gonna say, I like to talk about language, the power of language, and how I think you and I have actually talked about it before.
Yeah, we have.
And I just like to talk about how the use of language influences the way things are understood and the way that people are treated as well. And in your book, how did you employ language to either to show, the dismantling of stereotypes or how they are perpetuated?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I rely almost entirely on language for creation of voice. So what I'm aiming for is that as you're reading, I want you to be able to know who is speaking, even without me putting the label there. Like, that you should know immediately that this is Athena speaking, or you should know immediately that this is Imran speaking, and that kind of stuff. Mark Twain was incredibly good at this. I have troubles with some of his work, but he was a master of picking up local dialects. And if you follow Huck Finn, as Huck Finn goes up the Mississippi River, the dialect changes in the communities that he runs up against, and that's incredibly sophisticated writing. So I have trouble with some of his representations, but that is a skill that I just really, really admire. And so that's the sort of thing that I aim for. I want you to be able to tell right away who is doing the speaking. So Athena, she was in an institution for 30 years, and while she was there, she was heavily medicated, but there were books, and she could already read before she got there, so she already had that skill. So her words they are not she doesn't have a 2003 vocabulary. She kind of has a 1940s, 1950s vocabulary. She uses words in the ways that she read them in the books. So it's just very much how she speaks. Yeah. And then I'm going to add with language there. I'm going to add body language in there. There's a character, Imran, who is her supportive assisted living person, and he is extremely uncomfortable in certain situations. So at the very end, for instance, and that comes through almost entirely in his body language. So she is very good at reading body language, and I have found that people who are marginalized, my students who have been marginalized, they are often better at reading people's body language than my students who have had lives with less friction. And I think it's because they have to be able to read a situation in order to be safe. And so Imran is extremely uncomfortable. There's a point at the end where Athena takes him out to a nightclub, and she says, we are going to go dancing. And he thinks that, they're going to go watch the ballet. And they're not going. She takes him to a nightclub, and everybody there is stoned. And the kids are, they're in punk clothing and all that kind of stuff. And in this situation, Athena is much more comfortable than he is. She's never been in a nightclub before, but she recognizes right away the outcast vibe. And Imran is sort of like a walking stickling, and his body language is, it very much reveals who he is and his discomfort in this kind of a situation. And that was because I didn't think that Imran, I mean, just from his name, I hope that people pick up that he is, he's not mainstream white person, and what he cooks and all these kinds of things. And so there are these situations where most of the people are mainstream and white, and he's completely automatically very, very uncomfortable in that situation. Other things about language. There is, the person who edited it said that near the end, Athena receives 5 letters that were written by her mother to a family friend. And she has nothing else of her mother. And in these letters, her mother is talking about this child that she's looking for, that her husband institutionalized and she can't find. Those letters are written in a very, very different voice, because the mother is a journalist. She's the most educated person in the book, who has the non, she doesn't have a medical education, she has an arts education. And so yeah, her voice is very distinct, I hope. I hope it's very distinct. And that's partly because their conversations, you know, these are 2 journalists talking to one another, and they are talking about the business and about research. And they are both researching the history of institutions and disabilities. And they are both trying to, they use the phrase the system. They are both trying to dismantle the system, and they're very frank about it. And so, yeah, I think, so what I'm saying is that the language, what I aim for is to use language in such a way that the characters are, that each character is distinct and complex. So the publisher who first accepted the book, after he read the manuscript, he just said, you know, this protagonist, Athena, he said, she's so smart. Like, she's so smart. She's, and I realized that what he was saying was that in his head, the stereotype would be that she wouldn't be smart. That you know, she had spent all of this time in the institution. And she does talk about the fact that, you know, when she came out of the institution, so I worked in a group home where everybody had just been released from an institution in Northern Ontario, in Huntsville. So everybody was new to this group home from that institution. And many of them had never been outside in their entire life, or in their entire memory. And so they'd never walked on something that wasn't a perfectly smooth floor. So the first thing we had to do was go out and buy knee pads for everybody, because they were tripping all the time. So I'm not quite sure how I got there, but yes. But my point is that it's all language, and I don't want to be calling attention to stereotypes very much as I am dismantling it. There are a couple of times. There's a part of this excerpt, I excerpted a section on the bus ride where another passenger becomes incredibly ingratiating and saccharine towards Athena once he realizes she's deaf, and he starts wanting to take care of her. You know, I'm going to take you to where you want to go. And she's just awkward and says, you know, she writes on her notepad, I'm sorry, you are making me uncomfortable. I do not need your help. And he gets quite upset. You know, I have taught thousands of students as a mostly deaf person. And so that whole thing about deaf people need help. I wonder, is that what my students think? maybe they thought I needed help with grading, especially, but yeah. Yeah, I don't know if I've answered your question. Yeah.
Yep. Yes, you have. Thank you.
Yeah.
So does anyone have anything else they'd like to add, ask? We are at the end of our time. So I can maybe give you a minute or two if you want to say something real quick, and then we can close.
No, the only thing I want to say really, Valerie, is thank you. And not just thank you for the event, but what you have created in Tuseme Books, as I spend more and more time on your website, is something really unusual. And I think, well, just as we're talking about the stereotypes that those of us who are queer or disabled or whatever, people of color, you know, we run into them constantly. And the conscious way in which you are recommending how people can start thinking about that kind of stuff. I've never seen anything a bookstore quite like that, and I really, really appreciate it. And I hope that it survives, because it's hard for bookstores to survive in this world.
Yeah. Thanks for saying that. I appreciate it. So sign up for my newsletter if you want to help me survive.
Okay.
I Athena at the bookstore, so please get a copy for yourself. It's really an important read. As we've been listening to Ruth talking about her book, there's so much in there. So please get a copy, read it. I'm always available to chat, have book club type discussions on the side in Instagram or whatever. So please do that. So thank you so much, Ruth. We really appreciate having you here. Thanks for reading your book.
Thank you.
For everyone who was able to join us, thank you as well. I mean, the reason why we're able to have these events is because there are people who are coming in to watch, to listen, to ask questions of the authors, and just to create community together. So thank you for that. Those who were not able to join, this will be available for you to watch. So yeah, I think that's it. So everybody have a lovely evening, and I'll see you around.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Oh, okay. Me and you.